It's hard to imagine, really.
It is.
One of the questions asked by a fourth grader from, I believe, Aledo, Texas, this morning was, are there estimates on how many people died at the during the Dust Bowl, and if not, why is that?
And after that fourth grader asked that question, I had to ask myself, are you smarter than a fourth grader? Which I realized I probably wasn't. They didn't have very good tallies of the actual casualties of what is now universally recognized as the worst, call it man-made, call it natural disaster in American history. Here's why. You know, a storm comes through, a big hurricane, or a fire comes through and sweeps an area where I live, and people die. And you go out after 2 or 3 days and you see all the bodies and you just count how many people are in the hospital. Something like the Dust Bowl comes through. Now, there were big storms like Black Sunday, the mother of all dusters, April 14th. And you look like you lived through it the way you're shaking your head. But mostly it was a gradual thing. And that's what was so, not gradual, but almost random. That's what wore people down psychologically, was you had days like on Black Sunday morning, April 14th, that was a beautiful morning. Like Bluebird Day, Palm Sunday, gorgeous, and you thought the worst was over, and then boom, you just got hit with this monster. It was almost like an extra force, a malevolent force. So you had these things sort of wear you down psychologically. Now, as to the tally, people who died of what was called generically dust pneumonia. Really, it's more like, that's not a medical term, it's more like silicosis. Now, it's when these fine dust particles get into your lungs and it basically just breaks down the alveoli that hold the lungs together. I'll tell you 2 quick stories about that. I read a doctor's diary. He talked about treating people for dust pneumonia. It wasn't all elderly and the young. He talked about a 17-year-old boy who, otherwise strapping, strong, football-playing high school kid, who started coughing, couldn't sleep at night, and wake up in the morning and kick up all this stuff. And he went in to see this doctor, and the doctor looked down at him and he said, this is what the doctor wrote in his diary, he said, "Son, you are just filled up with dirt." And that kid died about a week later, according to the doctor's diary. And the second story is, I heard this from a guy I followed named Ike Austin. He just died a few years ago at age 95, landed at D-Day on Normandy Beach, amazing guy, lived through the Dust Bowl. This was from a family of 9 who lived in one of these little dugouts, about 400 square feet, family of 9. And I asked Ike, by the way, what was harder, Dust Bowl or World War II, landing at D-Day fighting the Nazis? And he said, without a doubt, it was the Dust Bowl. Because he said in World War II, there was a camaraderie. We knew what we were doing, hit the beach, move here, you know, a bunch of 22-year-old kids. But he said, the Dust Bowl, you didn't know where the next thing was going to come from. It was the randomness again. But he told me about his high school, and they were going to stage a play in their little auditorium, and they rehearsed the play for several weeks. Well, then, about 5 days before the play was going to open for their parents, the Red Cross moved in and converted their high school auditorium into a triage hospital, and they set it up with cots. I saw the pictures, a little red cots, and half the kids were in there coughing up with dust pneumonia. So, Guy, to answer your question, there never was a specific tally of how many people, because sometimes it would get you in a few weeks, sometimes it would take years and years. One of the women I spent a lot of time with, who came out here because her mother was a Broadway dancer, and the air in New York was so crappy that her doctor said, go to the Great Plains. Well, she ended up with dust pneumonia, but she met a cowboy and never left and loved this area. But she told me that when she was in her 60s, a doctor said, did you live in the coal mines or something? She goes, no. She goes, you smoke cigarettes? She goes, no. She goes, I don't know what it is, but your lungs are terribly, terribly impaired. So it could hit you, you know, after a few weeks, or it could take years and years and years. So that's why you couldn't have a specific tally.
In reading your book and looking at the variety of programs, there were programs through the Department of Interior, Department of Agriculture, the Civilian Conservation Corps employed like 22,000 young men to start those trees. Did you ever come across a reference to how much the federal government spent in trying to address the conditions of the Dust Bowl? Because if you look at the WPA built the first part of the museum and built buildings across this region. You can add up how much that cost.
Right.
But these programs are from a variety of departments. And did you ever come up with any figure?
I'm going to be honest with you. I did see a figure, but I've since forgotten it. So I had all these facts crammed into my head for a long time. I forgot that figure. I'll say this about the two things real quickly. One of the most fascinating things for me when I started trying to put this story together, and I was just you've heard of traveling salesman, I was a traveling historian. I would go from town to town and assemble people like this room. I would usually have no more than a dozen folks, and they were almost always women, because the women outlive the men. And the women, I hate to say this, guys, they have great stories and great memories, and they'd say, oh, I remember it as if it happened yesterday. It was a beautiful Sunday when the guys would just say, it was bad. And then they'd tell you, about a football game they saw, but they couldn't remember any of the details. But invariably, in one of these towns, somebody would take me out to show me a little bridge or a little something that the WPA had built that was all but forgotten. And they were damn proud of this. And you'd see etched on the side, built 1937, WPA. And I'd say, what's a bridge over nothing? Because there wasn't anything under. Well, there used to be a creek here, they'd say. But there was a little something left. And I think 200 years from now, when the traveling historians like me are going around, they may wonder, the town will be gone. Because what got me started on this Dust Bowl project was I was working on a story for the New York Times about vanishing small town America. And this is an interesting statistic. 2/3 of the counties at the western side of the high plains, 2/3 of them have less of a population now than they had 100 years ago. They are described as frontier by the census, which I think is 4 or 5 people per square mile. So these towns were built by the railroads to serve agriculture communities. Even in 1930, up to 1 in 3 of us Americans worked the land. You know what it is now? It's 1% or less. So we're not a nation of farmers. We forgot our farming heritage, except for great museums like this, which show it off and keep it alive. So one of those things is, to get to your point, I know I'm meandering a little bit here, is that you do see the legacy of that WPA in these, in these communities. The other thing was, people were damn happy to have a payroll come to town because there wasn't circulating money. It was a bartering economy in many cases. I forget who it was. Jan Brewer, the governor of Arizona, got in trouble this year for talking about, well, we could just exchange chickens for health care. But in fact, in the 30s, they did do that. This doctor I described, he got chickens all the time. He got paid in chickens. He would go see somebody and treat them, and they'd say, I don't have any money. People didn't have money. There's a woman who I followed throughout the book. She lived to be 101, the little girl who got up on her tippy toes and looked at the prairie when it was in its native state, and then lived through everything, worked in a one-room schoolhouse. When she was 17, had a class. Half of it was a sod house, and married her high school sweetie, and then lost a child, and saw all of this great, wonderful history. She remembered when a payroll came to town, because she said she taught for an entire year in that one-room schoolhouse, and what she was paid for was script. They gave her script which said she was able to go into town and get a few groceries, but she didn't get a dime for her services. She thought she would get $100 a month, which was her expected salary for teaching in this one-room schoolhouse. So when a payroll came to town, even though I couldn't answer the question about what it was a very big deal because it meant money was circulating, money was going around again.